Hello and welcome to JURIST Book Club, a forum that bridges the gap between ideas and the libraries, following a dialogue with the authors of new emerging research and scholarship, bringing those ideas to a global audience. Sit back, relax, and enjoy this interview with the author. Hello and welcome to JURIST Books. We are honored to have you, Dr. Friedman. And just to give an introduction about you, Dr. Jeremy Friedman is a Marvin Associate Professor at Harvard Business School, where he teaches business, government, and international economy. Along with it, his research focuses on the history of communism, socialism, and revolution in Russia, China, and the developing world. He examines how the project of socialist revolutions and leftist thoughts have more broadly evolved over the course of the 20th century, particularly as a revolutionary battleground shifted from the industrial countries to the developing world. And today we will be talking about his latest scholarship, Right for Revolution, Building Socialism in the Third World. It is a historical account of ideology in the global south as the post-war laboratory of socialism, its legacy following the Cold War, and the continuing influence of socialist ideas worldwide. The book traces a 40-year history of 5 countries: Indonesia, Chile, Tanzania, Angola, and Iran. We are honored to have you, Dr. Friedman.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
As we move on with the interview, Dr. Friedman, I would like to know how did you come up with the idea of this book, and how did you approach these 5 countries, and why specifically these 5 countries?
Well, so I think the idea of the book came more generally from a sense that the way we write about the history of the left is sort of has undergone this process of siloization, which I think is not simply the province of historians, but is something that was reflected during the Cold War itself, and made a lot of sense because, for example, in the West, socialist parties feared being associated with the Soviet Union or with communists, and so they sort of drew a harsh distinction between the communist left, the anti-communist left. This has led us to draw further distinctions between the old left, the new left, democratic socialists, social democrats, Marxists, Marxist-Leninists, non-Marxists, Maoists. And so we're sort of constantly chopping up the left on these ideological grounds. And I think that has led us to miss the ways in which practically there's a much broader discussion and cooperation on the left than there is sort of theoretically. And so the goal of this was to look at the development of socialist ideology and the development of leftist projects around the world in a practical sense. Almost to look at policymakers as intellectuals themselves, people putting ideas into practice, and therefore looking at the evolution of the left on a global scale in a practical way as opposed to a theoretical way. And so I think that's really the goal, is to get beyond, I think, the siloization on the left that was created for political purposes and has been sort of reified by historians. So that's the general impetus for the book. Why these 5 countries? So I could have picked many other countries. As I say in the book, this is really a global story, and what that means is it touched almost every country in the developing world in some way. So I could have picked India, I could have picked Egypt or Guinea or Nicaragua or any number of other countries, which had some version of socialism or state playing an interaction with this process. The 5 I picked, besides being ones that I felt I could get reasonable materials on, which is always a consideration for a historian, what archives are available and where you can go. I picked them because they span the geographic and chronological space of the Cold War. So 2 countries in Asia, 2 in Africa, 1 in Latin America, Indonesia really beginning with the late 40s into Iran with the mid 80s. So it covers the geographic and chronological space of the Cold War. But each of them also, for at least a short period of time, gained the attention of the global audience. So, for example, Angola is not usually on the front pages of most global newspapers, but for a period in late 1975, early 1976, it was. So these are all countries which sort of gained at least a brief period on center stage, and then also countries which became representative models, ways of answering sort of fundamental questions that others were dealing with. So, for example, in Tanzania, the issue of how to build socialism in an agrarian economy with very low industrialization, small working classes, without being heavily reliant on foreign aid or foreign investment, is the kind of dilemma that many of the countries face, and that Tanzania was sort of this paradigmatic version of. Chile is kind of the paradigm of how one builds socialism without violating sort of the norms of what they called bourgeois democratic constitutionalism, multi-party system, freedom of speech, things like that. So these countries were briefly on the center of the world stage, but also represented kind of these paradigmatic questions that everybody else was dealing with in some form or another.
Most certainly. So you clearly mentioned that the period of these have been around 40 years, and you talk about imperialism, that these countries had a pattern of socialism growing post independence when the imperialism came to end. So could you describe this relation of imperialism with socialism and its rise?
Well, so the connection between the rise of imperialism and socialism, of course, traces very strongly back to Lenin's connection, imperialism, the highest age of capitalism, the pamphlet he wrote in 1916, which connected the world revolution with an anti-imperialist process. That somehow decolonization was a fundamental element of the world revolution, precisely because the creation of overseas European empires was a product of capitalism in crisis. And so, just the same way that empires had been created by capitalism, part of the revolution was the deconstruction of empires. And this was, there were politically tactical reasons for this, but it was also, an ideological claim. I think in the period I'm looking at, the question really is, how does the anti-imperialist struggle shape the nature of socialist revolution? And I think it does so in very important ways, because it really adds an element of nationalism, national reconstruction, national dignity, as fundamental tasks of the socialist revolution, which is not necessarily the way that Marx or even really Lenin intended them. So if you think about the famous quote, the workers have no nationality, by the 1960s and 1970s, we've come a very long way from that. And so what socialist revolution means in places like Tanzania or Angola is in many cases, national self-assertion against a former colonial metropole, which, in theory is supposed to be a way of kind of, getting beyond capitalist relations and ultimately, seeing society back in terms of class divisions, but nevertheless takes on a very long period of time in which divisions are seen as being ethnic or national or racial, as opposed to being, class-based and economic. And so I think the real key here is that imperialism makes people see sort of the goal of revolution as national dignity, national reconstruction. We see this, I think, most clearly of all, of course, in the Chinese Communist Party, which, the famous saying of Mao in September 1949, right, the Chinese people have stood up, 中国讲起来了, right? 中华人民讲起来了. This is sort of, to this very day, if you look at the way the Chinese Communist Party explains socialism and justifies its actions, it's as much about, right, restoring China's place in the world as it is about, creating equality among the Chinese people or egalitarianism in the Chinese economy. And so I think it's really a fundamental shift in that, imperialism makes socialist revolution as much about national dignity and shifting international power relations as it is about, domestic equality.
So, from what I understand, so for these countries, socialism was also a method of going beyond being what was called British subjects. So they were reclaiming their own positions in the society by trying to get new things which perhaps were only available to their white counterparts. And all the countries that you have looked upon, they're mostly non-white countries. So how do they achieve it through socialism? And is that the only method or the model that they look at?
Well, I don't think my book necessarily says they were successful. The socialist projects were successful in bringing developing countries up to the level of, let's say, per capita income of the developed countries. I think, that was one of the initial goals. Because when you think about independence, independence was not necessarily sold to the population as, this is just a matter of national independence and nothing else. It was sold as, this is step one towards us achieving the kind of living standards that people have elsewhere in the world. The idea being, of course, that imperialism had held them back economically, and so release from imperialism would allow them to catch up. And so in that sense, right, even the Soviets saw in the 1960s that if you only have political independence, but you don't have economic growth that goes along with it, right, independence will ultimately fail and lead to, dissatisfaction and disillusionment, which in many cases it did. So I think catching up was a central goal, and the belief was that socialism as a means of catching up would be quicker and easier than following capitalist path. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One was simply the lack of capital, right? If, these countries don't have capital available for investment. So socialism provided at least, the possibility of A, the state could provide capital, and B, you get it through foreign aid from the Soviet Union or elsewhere. So one was simply a lack of capital, right? You couldn't trust, Western investors to necessarily invest in the sectors you wanted to grow, right? They might invest more in natural resources. If you wanted to, build a manufacturing economy, you might not be able to rely on FDI, international capital market. So just the availability of capital was one. The second was simply the success or the seeming success of the Soviets and the Chinese, right? It seemed like they had grown much faster, the Soviets in the 1930s and the Chinese in the 1950s, than Western capitalist countries have. And you think about how long it took, let's say the United Kingdom or the United States or even Germany, right, to achieve the levels of growth that the Soviets did, claiming levels of 20% GDP growth, year after year in the 1930s. So it seemed like it was also faster to do with central planning. So one is, getting capital. The second is speed. The third is it seemed like it would not necessarily, result in the kind of levels of inequality, right? You think about the Industrial Revolution in the West and sort of Oliver Twist and that, the whole narrative around inequality. Maybe you could avoid that sort of, robber baron capitalism, which seemed like a necessary stage to follow the capitalist path. And the final claim was just, and this relates to dependency theory and such, was that without socialism, without somehow asserting yourself against the capitalist system, you'd be forever in a position of dependence, right? Because the capitalist economies were so powerful that they would keep developing countries in the position of providers of natural resources, right? They would reap the benefits of productivity gains for themselves and for their own workers. And so you'd be perpetually facing declining terms of trade. And so the only way out of this was, protect your market and use state-led investment or investment in the socialist world to build up your own industry. And so it seemed like it was the only way out of this trap of perpetual dependence on natural resources.
Most certainly. What I would like to touch upon next is that you mentioned that Tanzania provides a very distinct example in the African subcontinent while talking about socialism, while many people even called it unscientific for many reasons, and it turned out to be disastrous, according to you. Would you elaborate on the unique nature of Tanzania in the subcontinent with respect to socialism, and why does it come across as very unique?
Well, so just to be clear, I use the term unscientific in quotations because that's how the Soviets referred to it. I'm not labeling socialism as scientific or unscientific myself. But of course, there were many versions of socialism outside of Marxism, and so one of the ways that Marxism distinguished itself was this claim to being scientific, which is, I think, another topic that we can deal with at a different time. But I think what made Tanzanian socialism unique was, first of all, its reliance on agriculture. And if you think about the classic Marxist model, right, socialism is supposed to happen in the most advanced industrial economies, and the reasons for this are clear, because the idea is that capitalism is a way of developing the forces of production to their utmost, and then once the forces of production have been developed, there's, as Marx say, a contradiction between the forces of production, which have the capacity to produce far more, and the relations of production, i.e. property rights, which prevent, right, that plenty from being distributed to the population. And so what ultimately you have to do is the state just has to take over the forces of production and redistribute, right, the production itself. In a place like Tanzania, where you have an agrarian economy, very little industry, you don't really have developed forces of production, right? So the whole notion of Marxism, right, has been sort of thrown on its head, because now instead of socialism taking over the means of production, you have to actually create them first. So that's one. So there's one issue with that. The second issue is that socialism depends upon, or this Marxist socialism depends upon class struggle being the engine of history, right? That one class, a newer class, fights the older class, and in the process, right, this creates new political and economic realities. And one of the key tenets of African socialism, as Nyerere saw it, was that Africa does not have classes, right? In the sense that the exploiting classes in African economies were the European imperialists. They were not Africans themselves. And so after independence, the bourgeoisie are simply gone. They're not people who have to be expropriated, or they're not, a class that has to be somehow, destroyed or liquidated like in the Soviet Union. They're simply not there. And so there's no need for class struggle in African socialism. And so, what's unique is that he's trying to build, a socialist economy that both has no industry and no working class, and supposedly has no class struggle as well. And so these are all things that, the Soviets see as unscientific. The Soviets think that there's no such thing as socialism without a working class, without class struggle, without industry. But this is the kind of socialism that Nyerere tried to build without following the Soviet path.
So I think more on a structural level, this ideology would have survived if it was looked upon from a perspective of the political leaders wanting to colonize the economic space. Is that correct? Would you agree with that?
You mean you're asking what would have made it successful?
Yes.
I think fundamentally the problem, there were a number of issues, but I think one of the biggest issues was, the lack of capital, right? Because, there's not a lot of capital in Tanzania to begin with. And there wasn't in the 60s. And I think the perception of ideological heterodoxy on the part of the Soviets and others led them to limit the amount of aid they were willing to provide, right? So the capital was not going to come from the investment was not going to come from the Soviet Union or from other socialist countries. And so what Tanzania essentially tried to do was, it had an agrarian economy. The idea was to create agricultural communes, create a surplus for export, sell that surplus for export, and use the proceeds to then invest in industry. And that sort of method of bootstrapping your way towards capital investment, especially in the world of the 1960s and 1970s, was incredibly difficult. It became impossible after the oil crisis when the terms of trade went strongly against Tanzania, and all of a sudden industrial goods and everything else that had to be transported became far more expensive. And Tanzania is, of course, an oil importer as well. So I think, it came up against the simple lack of capital. And there were other issues as well in terms of the efficiency of the bureaucracy. But I think that was probably its biggest issue.
So it's the more political structure that failed the system itself at a more fundamental level.
The political structure, but I think, and the political structure especially internationally as well, but also the economic world it was existing in which, that sort of bootstrapping strategy was simply unrealistic.
No, certainly. I am more interested in the last chapter of your book, which deals with Iran. So you mentioned that it moved from a more extremist Islamism, there was a replacement of Islamism to a more socialist idea. Could you elaborate how religion played a significant role while looking into the aspect of socialism, especially in the Iranian and Middle East region?
Well, so my argument is not that Iran moved from Islamism to socialism. In a sense, it's actually the opposite. My argument is that Islamism came to replace socialism as the anti-imperialist ideology par excellence in Iran and later in much of the Middle East. So the idea is that, if you look at where the Middle East is in the 1940s and 1950s, socialism has a lot of traction. So Nasser is attracted to socialism, Ben Bella in Algeria, the Ba'athist parties in Iraq and Syria have very strong elements of socialism, and these are all secular political leaders who aren't really playing on Islam, and this is really kind of a dominant element. In this period of time, the Middle East is very much in line with the growth of socialism in the rest of the post-colonial world. So it's not that different from what's happening in India or what's happening in Indonesia or in Burma or Ghana and Mali and all sorts of other places. What happens though is that, as I said before, right, the connection between socialism and imperialism, means that social revolution in the developing world becomes as much tied up with, the reassertion of national dignity as it does with economic growth and economic egalitarianism. And so, this becomes kind of personified in the figure of Nasser, who's really the leader of the Arab world in the 1960s. And so, the idea of socialism as being, the way for, the Middle East and the Arabs in particular to sort of reassert themselves on the world stage comes to a crashing halt in the 6-Day War. Right? This is kind of, a major defeat for Nasser, for Egypt, for Pan-Arabism, for really the entire sort of Arab nationalist project. And, the connection between the failure of Arab nationalism and the failure of Arab socialism is kind of inevitable. And so, this leads to a crisis in the Middle East. Of course, then there's the Yom Kippur War, which is the second defeat that sort of confirms, what happened to Nasser. And so the failure of socialism to achieve, reassertion of national dignity is an important failure, and an important moment. And so there's this disillusionment. There had been, Iran, for example, there had been a very large radical left, Marxist left around the Middle East. Turkey had a very large communist party. The Syrians and the Iraqis both had large communist parties. And there were, there was the Tudeh in Iran was the dominant political party in the 1940s and early 50s. There was a very large political left in Iran. And so, a lot of people believed in this project. But the promises of the socialist project, right, were, a number of things, not just economic growth, economic egalitarianism, as I said, national reassertion, national dignity. These are, you think about Iran, Iran is a country with a long imperial history, which felt itself victimized by colonial powers, just like China did, India, and others. And so, where it ends up is, you have the Shah, who's seen as a tool of the West. And so in that sense, Iran has sort of failed to reassert itself on the world stage, even though the Shah wants to become a world power. Economic inequality is growing. And so in all these ways, both domestically and internationally, it seems that socialism has failed to live up to its promises, right? It's not bringing economic growth and, national anti-imperial self-assertion the way that it had promised. And so Islamism begins to make these claims that it can do what socialism was promising to do, but it can do it better, right? That the way towards justice and egalitarianism is through Islam rather than through socialism. The way to restore Iran's position in the world is through Islam and Islamic revolution rather than socialism. And so this discourse begins to develop among the Iranian religious leadership already in the 1940s. So Ayatollah Talabani is the Ayatollah of the largest mosque in Tehran in the 1940s at a time when many of the youth are attracted towards Marxism and the Tudeh. And Talabani begins to develop a version of Islam which says, that Islam can provide economic justice. Islam can provide, national self-assertion, dignity on the world stage. And this is what begins to happen. So it's not so much, right, it's not that socialism replaces Islam, it's that Islam says we can fulfill the promises of socialism, right, after socialism's already failed. And that's really, I think, a large part of the way that the Islamists gained political traction in the 1980s in Iran.
So, coming back to more of a religious point, you have referenced the clerics and their intentions of retaining their power and property in the provinces. So, did they use religion as a tool for a more personal gain as opposed to a more socialist gain? The clerics in Iran.
Well, I think there were important distinctions between, different clerics in Iran. And, Khomeini is the key operator in the 1980s. So one thing that's interesting about the Iranian Revolution is a lot of the early revolutionaries are still very much, prominent today. So you look at, someone like Mir Hussein Mousavi, who was an early supporter of the revolution then and became a leader of the Green Movement, a rebel against the regime really from the 2000s later on. And you can see that, there's a certain group who were religious figures, but who became disillusioned with the revolution precisely because, right, it took on this conservative tack, especially economically. And, there were key moments, key battles in the 1980s. So people like, Mir Hussein Mousavi and at the time Rafsanjani and others, right, were pushing for a more radical land reform, for example. We're pushing for more state-led investment. We're pushing for the kinds of economic programs that they believe serve social justice and that looked a lot like socialist programs elsewhere in the world. And they kept running, and they dominated the Majlis in the early years of the Iranian Islamic Republic, right? So in the early 1980s, the Majlis was passing all of this radical economic legislation. And the problem was you had these senior clerics on the Guardian Council, and the way the Iranian government is set up, right? The Guardian Council gets to decide, what violates Islam and what does not. So the Majlis could pass bills, the land reform being a key one, and Ayatollahs like, Gul Paigani, senior people who are much less sympathetic towards socialism, would declare this legislation to be anti-Islamic. So land reform dies in the Guardian Council because they declare that this violates Islamic notions of private property. And there are very distinct differences between different clerics on what exactly the Islamic position on private property is supposed to be. So it wasn't like these things were necessarily foreordained. But the key, of course, is when Khomeini sides with the Guardian Council over the Majlis. And for many, that's sort of a disillusioning moment. But that really takes place, 1983, 1984, 1985, after the Islamists have already defeated the left. So it becomes this internal battle between different types of Islamists. Excuse me.
Bless you.
Sorry about that.
Bless you.
Thanks.
I think I get more clarity on why you call Iran as the most strange and logical product of socialism at the end of the day now. Now I want to move the question from a more theoretical perspective to a more methodological perspective. As I know that you're very proficient in several languages, did you encounter any difficulties while trying to access the resources and the archives which were necessary for this book, since you're tracking a 40-year-old journey in the 20th and 21st century? Could you let us know about what were the challenges you faced while looking at these archives, especially some things which are so sensitive politically?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's a very difficult project, and I was not able to get anything like the total amount of material I would have liked. And of course, most of the research was completed by 2019 or in 2019, which in a post-COVID world, this would be very different. We'll see what happens. I would say, so one issue is that in many of the countries I study, really in all of the countries I study, actually, the history that I write about is very, very contemporary and very relevant to contemporary politics. The 1965 massacres in Indonesia are very much alive in Indonesian politics. The recent president of Chile, someone who identifies with Allende, his opponent identifies with Pinochet. The recently deceased president of Tanzania is someone who came to power, with a promise to sort of resurrect Nyerere and Jamal. So, given the sensitivities in these countries, the nature of the regimes, they're not necessarily willing to open up files that relate to this. So Indonesia, for example, the files of the Indonesian Communist Party from this period are basically inaccessible. Government files are inaccessible from the 1960s, most of them. I was able to get a little bit of material in Tanzania, but the Tanzanian government is also sort of moving in a much more closed political direction. And so I wasn't able to get very much there. Obviously, as an American doing research in Iran right now is pretty much a non-starter. I actually have a colleague who attempted to do research on the 19th century in Iran and ended up spending 3 years in prison, accused of espionage. So there were certainly no files that I was going to be able to see in Iran right now. And one of the biggest obstacles was actually China. So I have a lot of Chinese materials in my book, but I was fortunate to get all of those materials between 2008 and 2010 because under Xi Jinping, the Chinese have essentially locked down their archives, especially the archive of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, which had been briefly opened under Hu Jintao. And so I was able to use those materials. Literally every single Chinese document that I cite in my book has been reclassified in Beijing as no longer accessible. So really the key sources that I use, luckily, and this probably is counterintuitive for a lot of people, Russian archives have become more and more open over time. I went back to Moscow in 2019 because the Russians declassified a vast amount of new material, and they've continued declassifying. So, I don't know what's happening at this current moment, tensioning Russia and the West. but until very, very recently, the Russians had been opening more and more materials. And, the Soviet Union was fantastic at producing paper. So there's an infinite amount of documentation. Just for example, when it comes to Chile, in the 1970s, the International Department of the Communist Party, just based on, conversations that it had with people inside Chile, was producing roughly 1,000 pages a year of, just transcripts of conversations with Chilean political activists. So, an enormous amount of material. So the Soviet documents are useful. The real key for my research is actually East German archives, which of course, are totally open, are in German, and the East Germans were very heavily involved with Soviet foreign policy in the developing world. And so in many cases, for example, my Iran chapter, those files are still mostly closed in Moscow. They're totally inaccessible in Iran. But given that the Tudeh party was headquartered in East Germany, the East Germans were involved in everything, and they got copies of every conversation. So the things I couldn't see in Moscow, I could see in Berlin. I did a lot of other research elsewhere. So, Tanzania, South Africa. I spent time in Chile, and then other Eastern Bloc archives, Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, colonial stuff in Portugal. But really, Russian and German archives were probably the key to the project.
So I think as globalization happens, we are opening our present, but we're closing our archives for the global community. And I can only imagine how difficult it must have been as an American to access so many of these archives. Did any of the archival sources from the American intelligence sources or the American foreign services help you while doing this? While doing the research?
So for certain chapters, I used State Department files, especially U.S. Embassy files. In Iran, that didn't work because the U.S. Embassy was seized and was dysfunctional from November 1979 on. In many cases, especially later on, the CIA files, especially in Iran, are not totally accessible yet. But one thing to keep in mind is that you'd be surprised at times how misguided American intelligence estimates can be. In the documents I've seen on Iran, for example, U.S. intelligence is obsessed with the idea that the Soviet Union is imminently going to invade Iran and impose a Soviet-style regime on it, which never seemed to be in the cards for Moscow. There was actually, I even saw one CIA report that said, it was literally titled Mexico, the next Iran, ? There are times when U.S. materials are useful, but given that I'm studying the left, I'm studying communist parties in many cases. The Soviets have much better intelligence. They have much better access. They have a deeper understanding of what's going on. For example, in Indonesia. Despite the fact the Indonesian Communist Party shifts towards being more pro-Chinese by the end than pro-Soviet, nevertheless, there are still many members in the Indonesian Communist Party who are sympathetic towards the Soviet Union and will then, give information to Soviet diplomats and others, while the U.S. is basically guessing from the outside about what's really happening. For that reason, there are times when U.S. materials are useful, but if you're studying the left, the U.S. is not always the best informed.
That's quite insightful in many ways. So, coming to the end of your book, you mentioned that this is a motive to study the global process of socialism, and this is just a beginning step for it. So, could you enlighten us with what could be the future of this particular scholarship of studying socialism from a global phenomena? And do you have any more projects going on with respect to this?
I think there's a lot of work to be done. I think there's very little that takes. We increasingly have a field history of capitalism, which sort of understands that capitalism evolves over time, and that capitalist models that are developed in one place, affect capitalism elsewhere, can be transported and such. And this is what history. And so, history of capitalism is a growing field, and we don't have a history of socialism yet. I think we need one, and I think this book is hopefully a first step towards a history of socialism that looks something like our history of capitalism. Because I think for some people, of course, there was this idea that socialism was this misguided project that failed, and I don't think it makes sense to say that socialism failed in the sense that, it's been discredited and now disappeared and, has been superseded, any more than it makes sense to say that, Christianity failed because, Christ has not returned. Every time there's a prediction of salvation and it doesn't come true, the ideology changes, right? There's a shift, there's a new denomination, there's a new theology. I think that's true with socialism as well. So, the version of socialism that we saw under Stalin, right? Central planning, party state control. I think that version is, dead, at least, as far as those trying to implement socialism elsewhere. But other versions that rely on markets and such are just, are being born. And so I think that, we have to, we need a scholarship that looks at socialist experiments with, more deeply at Yugoslavia, more deeply at Hungarian reforms, socialist experiments in places like, Madagascar, Nicaragua, and Burma and such. Because, there was a period of time in the 1980s and 1990s when socialism was very much an eclipse in the West. But then, somehow it begins to come back with the anti-WTO protests, anti-globalization protests in Seattle. In the United States, of course, then there's, the Occupy Wall Street movement. And to some people, it seemed like it came out of nowhere with Bernie Sanders' campaign in 2016. But Bernie Sanders' campaign, right, didn't really come out of nowhere. It built on a tradition that had, existed since the 1960s and earlier. Democrats vs. America, Michael Harrington and such. But sort of came back into bloom and has relied in its modern incarnation very, very heavily on socialist discourses that were very lively, for example, in Latin America in the 1990s. And, sort of anti-globalization, dependency theory and such, that were in eclipse in the West, but were sort of maintained and evolved elsewhere in the world. And so I think, we need a field of scholarship that, looks at the history of socialism the way it looks at the history of capitalism. And I think that field of scholarship has to concentrate really outside of the developing world, or outside of the developed world, the first world, for the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s especially. My next book, I hope, is going to look at the evolution of the left in the first world, from the 1960s to the end of the Cold War. So we sort of see the shift from the old left to the new left, and then what became of kind of leftist thinking, and what remains after the Cold War ends. And I think we need a much more serious reckoning as well with what the end of the Cold War has meant for the global left, and how it's reconstructed itself. But yeah, I hope this book is a first step towards history of socialism being a field on par with the history of capitalism.
Well, certainly, I think I've been very lucky to have read this book before conducting this interview, and it certainly looks at sources which I couldn't even think of. As you mentioned, you got sources in Germany which you couldn't get in Moscow or in Iran. And certainly, it's the dedication and passion which you reflect for this scholarship is going to take this beacon ahead, and we certainly hope to see more body working around this scholarship. Thank you so much, Dr. Friedman. It has been a delight and a pleasure to interview you, and we really look forward to your book, Ripe for Revolution, Building Socialism in the Third World, which is being published by Harvard University Press. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
We look forward to having you at more of our events at JURIST. Thank you.
I hope so. Thank you.